We made it to Facebook Live. My first time doing that, because usually Maya does it. And so today it's just myself and Mike, and we're going to be talking about section 3.1.2 of RIOS, the section with regards to environmental risk. And then also section 4.5, where to discuss environmental controls. Because risks in general should be controlled to minimize their impact. So without further ado, I'm going to read from the standard, and then Mike is going to give us the breakdown. So 3.1.2, important environmental impacts. Recyclers shall evaluate environmental factors and potential impacts to identify those important environmental impacts of their operations. A, criteria used in determining actual or potential environmental impacts and the results of evaluation shall be documented in the RIOS footprint.
Okay, so the first part, recyclers shall evaluate environmental factors and potential impacts to those important environmental impacts of their operation. So the first thing here is like, what are environmental factors? So one of the things that we always look at is what are things that can cause impacts to land, air, or water, or are a use of resources like gas, electricity, water, material, those things like that. And so the activities that are concerned here are, for instance, if you have outdoor activity, there may be an impact to stormwater because there's tracking of material through the forklift or other stuff that's stored outside. So your the environmental factor is the outside activity, and the potential impact is pollution to stormwater. So some of those things need to be defined, and you have to set some type of criteria for using how to score these so you know which ones are more severe or important impacts, and you can set necessary controls for those things. So there's many types of different criteria that people use. Some people do severity times occurrence, to get a risk score, but that's more commonly used for health and safety risk or hazards. So sometimes the environmental scoring is a little bit more complex and has factors that add into, like, is it a legal regulatory requirement? What is the impact upon the environment? What's the impact to human health? What's the impact to neighbors or the community or, public interest? So sometimes your environmental criteria might be more kind of complicated than the health and safety risk criteria. It depends on your system. It says criteria used in determining actual or potential environmental impacts, and the results of the evaluation shall be documented in the RIOS footprint. So whatever type of criteria you use, you need to make sure that it is kept as documented information, and you follow that criteria for scoring the environmental factors in determining potential or actual impacts.
So even though it says that just the criteria needs to be documented, I think it's safe to say that as a general rule, your identification of the environmental factors and impacts should also be documented, right?
I think that's going to come up in the next clause section here.
Let's see.
Because it's saying like criteria.
Here we go.
So,
the environmental impacts of all activities, products, and services within the scope of the RIOS management system, including outside providers and activities listed in 3.1 shall be evaluated.
So so this is saying once you've developed the criteria, then you need to go out and identify all the activities, like I talked about, outdoor activity and effects to stormwater. But there may be other things like outside providers. If you use third-party trucking, like what their impact upon the pollution to the air. Is there a policy for them to not idle? So that's part of the environmental controls that we're going to talk about in 4.5. So once you determine the criteria, then you need to look at all the potential impacts from all your activities, products, and services within the scope of your management system. So everything that you're doing, including outsourced providers. So trucking, or maybe you have some, like a collection site that's like not at your facility, but part of your scope. Maybe do collection of e-scrap at a collection site every quarter or something like that. So that stuff should be included as part of your footprint for, the environmental impacts. So it shall be evaluated.
This should say C, I'm sorry. Important environmental impacts shall be controlled, monitored, and evaluated.
Okay, so once you set the criteria, right, and then you identify those things and evaluate all of them, based upon your criteria, you're going to get ones that score and become important. So you have to set a criteria at which some point the impacts that you're scoring are considered important. And the ones that are considered important under that criteria need to be controlled. So we're talking about controls. So we're going to go to 4.5 to talk about controls, but those controls that are in place should be monitored and evaluated. Meaning that you need to have some method in place to ensure that those environmental controls are monitored and evaluated, periodically. So for instance, you might have like a monthly walkthrough where you're looking at some of the aspects or the environmental impacts in your yard and evaluating whether or not the controls in place are appropriate. So for instance, if you have outdoor activity and one of your controls to prevent pollution to stormwater is cleaning up spills when they occur, but you go on a monthly walkthrough and you see a spill that hasn't been cleaned up and you ask the supervisor and they say, oh, we don't know anything about it, and talk to employees and say like, oh, I think that's been there since yesterday, then obviously your controls are not effective. So you have to have the ability to monitor controls to make sure that these important aspects or impacts that are being controlled are also being effectively controlled through monitoring and evaluation of them in some manner, whatever is appropriate for you. It doesn't need to be through a monthly walkthrough, but that's just kind of an example of how some may be monitored.
And I think, okay, so after you like identify and analyze your environmental risks and assign it a score, and so let's say maybe like 5 of your risks are considered significant based on the scoring criteria that you've established for yourself. And then over time, of course, we want to like promote improvement and continue to reduce our impacts to the environment. So let's say those significant or important environmental impacts went down, like the score got reduced because we implemented all these control measures and like we're doing so great, and like the risk is very, very low now. So how does that, because the how does that reconcile with this that says that you have to like identify your like most critical environmental aspects? And what happens when you don't have any critical environmental aspects?
So if you don't have anything that fall under the threshold of important environmental impacts, then you should treat whatever your highest scored one is, if it doesn't meet the criteria, as an important environmental impact. So if you're below the criteria, then you need to treat the highest scoring one or ones as important environmental impacts. And like you can monitor this like on an annual basis or as processes change. There's other monitoring that may be done like the monthly walkthrough, but like like you're talking about the rescoring of these things based upon the effectiveness of control. So something like that's probably done like on an annual basis when these important impacts, or all of your impacts are reviewed and rescored based upon the effectiveness of training and controls that are in place. So once you do rescore that to show continual improvement of your management system, you need to be able to treat important aspects that may not be scored in the criteria of important aspects, but are your highest scored as important.
Yeah, so, but the reason I asked that is to like point out, like, then at that point, your criteria has changed. So then this document, wherever you've documented this criteria used in determining the actual or potential environmental impacts, that needs to be addressed and updated as appropriate.
Yeah, I mean, you could lower the criteria at that point, or you could keep it high and just treat the highest scoring environmental impacts as important.
Okay. So any closing thoughts with regards to identifying the environmental impacts?
No.
I'm going to go, we're going to jump to 4.5 so that we can so that we can talk about the controls that are related to the environmental impacts. So, and here we are. Bear with me one moment. So sorry about that. Okay. So now we're at section 4.5, where we're going to talk about environmental controls. And the way these are related, like Mike mentioned, is that when you evaluate all the different aspects or potential impacts that your organization's activities have, then you implement controls to reduce or mitigate the risk or reduce the impact if it occurs. And here's where, but and a lot of times the organization already has control measures in place. But here's a requirement with regards to environmental controls. Recyclers shall control those operations and activities that are associated with the identified important actual or potential environmental impacts in the RIOS footprint, and where the implementation of controls is necessary, including legally required, to limit adverse environmental impacts.
So let's continue with the kind of example of stormwater, right? So we're talking about outdoor activity being the potential environmental activity, and the impact being pollution to stormwater. So in this instance, the control, depending on what you're doing, maybe the appropriate control may be have a spill kit on site, having people trained, having a stormwater pollution prevention plan, having a spill prevention, containment, and countermeasure plan in place. So all of these things are, and some of those are legally required as referenced here, depending on your activities, right? So the controls may be voluntary, or they may be something that is required by law based upon your activity, or regulated based upon the activity that you're doing. So those things are forms of controls, you know, in terms of putting like something in place with the document, like a SWIP, stormwater pollution prevention plan, or doing training with employees to get them aware of what they need to do to conform to this control, or to have some type of material like a spill kit in place. So all of those things are types of, or even installing something like a berm or a stormwater treatment system, are kind of controls that are examples of this. So it depends on, you know, the important environmental impact to determine what the appropriate controls are. So when you identify an important environmental impact, then you need to implement the necessary controls. Also notice that it says actual or potential environmental impacts. So one of the things here is potential environmental impacts could be like fire, right? It's not necessarily something that is happening, but could happen and could cause environmental impacts based upon burning and other types of material that are present at your facility. And so like having drills, having an emergency action plan, emergency preparedness and response, having, you know, necessary fire extinguishers or hoses or other forms, you know, communicated to employees in terms of training of what to do in case of a fire, are all controls for potential environmental impacts. Whereas like when you have outdoor activity and pollution to stormwater is an actual impact, then you have other types of controls in place as well.
And you're saying outside activity, but that also means like outside storage, right?
I'm saying outdoor activity like doing processing, not outdoor storage of material. Yeah, maybe outdoor activity as well. If you're storing stuff outside, it could, because there's stuff stored outside that's exposed to stormwater, and there's forklifts coming in and out, or however, whatever your method of bringing it to and from the yard, warehouse, building, whatever.
Right. So that's an example of it's not activity. You're not doing anything. You may not be doing anything outside. You may just be putting stuff there for. And a lot of organizations do keep maybe inventory outside because it's just too much to store in their warehouse. And if you are doing that, especially in the recycling industry, metal especially, like that's mostly kept outside. You think about that the activity of storing it may also be the requirement that you implement an IIPP. I'm sorry, SWIP, SWPPP, Stormwater Pollution Prevention Plan, which is really a way of self-reporting and monitoring your stormwater. And there has been severe legal repercussions. Mike can speak to it because he was an environmental lawyer, of organizations who didn't consider themselves required to maintain a stormwater pollution prevention plan and report on their stormwater samples annually or quarterly or biannually or whatever. And they were sanctioned pretty heavily. And caused to pay lots of dollars in fines to the government and to individuals who have the right to sue an organization under the Stormwater Act for damage to the environment. So the cost of that, it can be exponential. For more information on SWIPs, please contact Glenview Group at info@glenviewgroup.com for documentation and guidance with regards to that. But anyway, moving on. So subsection A says that recyclers shall document and implement controls for all important environmental impacts, stipulating operation criteria in the plan.
So this is just saying that you need to have those controls, whatever they are, documented. And whatever kind of operating criteria is necessary for that particular control. So if, for instance, there's like fire extinguishers or spill kits, stuff like that, people need to know how to use those things as well. So stuff like that is a required part of the documentation under the RIOS standard there.
B, environmental controls shall be established for all activities, source materials, products, and services within the scope of the RIOS management system that are identified in the RIOS footprint as having an important environmental impact.
So yeah, again, this is saying that environmental controls are required for important environmental impacts. So this is kind of just fleshing it out and saying like, you need to consider all things. You need to consider everything that's within the scope of your management system. And it may be stuff that doesn't occur at your yard or at your facility. So it may occur offsite, and it has to be, all activities that are occurring. You can't just do one section. There might be other things like considering the office. How does the office have environmental impacts like water usage or electrical usage or various other things that may be pertinent to considering whether or not it's an important environmental impact.
What is this source material? How do you establish an environmental control for source material?
So it's a matter of how you treat it when it gets there on site. So source material is the material you're getting from your supplier, right, or customer. It depends on the wording of how you're looking at this under the RIO standard. But the material coming in, if it's like contaminated, or like for instance, metal that you get that's coming from like a milling machine might have oils on it that may be leaking out. So you need to consider, like, what are the source controls that I have in place when I'm receiving this material to ensure that the oil is put into a container that is not going to leak throughout the yard and cause an impact to stormwater. there you go again.
Right.
Or some other type, potential trip and falls, or other environmental problems as well.
And also, so this entire phrase, it almost sounds like that the controls are only required for environmental impacts that the organization has considered important. I'm searching
Yes.
for the word here. But I don't know if you want to speak about that. Like, don't ignore other non-important environmental impacts, right? Because they may be required by legal regulation, or just makes good common sense.
Yeah, that is, yeah, that's true. I mean, you're first and foremost bound to the regulatory requirements. That's your minimum performance under like a RIOS management system in regards to the footprint, which we'll get to talking about legal and regulatory compliance. So that's the bare minimum. If you have something that is not considered important, but is required or regulated, then you need to have the proper controls in place to comply with whatever pertinent regulation is affixed to that activity or impact.
Right. But I mean, of course, if it's legal, then you have to have a control. But even if it's not a legal requirement, like, I feel like for improvement purposes, just have a control there. Like if it's impacting
Yeah,
operations,
I mean, that's kind of a best practice, but
best
it's not, but it's a best practice, and it could be something to show improvement, but it's not required by the standard.
Yeah. All right. Well, that brings us to the end of environmental risk and environmental controls. Do you have any closing thoughts, Mike?
Not that I can think of right now.
Okie dokie. Well, thank you for watching and listening. And please join us next week. We're going to be talking about health and safety risk and health and safety controls. And if you join on the webinar, there is a link on our website. You can join us and ask questions and get some free consulting for your organization. Or if you need to implement or transfer from a different standard to a RIOS standard, or vice versa, please reach out to Glenview Group at info@glenviewgroup.com, and go to our website, glenviewgroup.com, for a list of trainings we offer with regards to the RIOS and the R2 standard, and various other ISO management standards. And thank you for being here, and see you next week.
Bye.